It was a cool autumn morning in the bustling city when Sarah, a 32-year-old black administrative assistant, set out for work. As she merged onto the highway, she glanced down at her speedometer, carefully adhering to the posted limit. Sarah took pride in being a responsible, law-abiding driver, always mindful of traffic regulations. Suddenly, the familiar sight of flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Sarah's heart raced as she pulled over to the side of the road, wondering what she could have done wrong. She took a deep breath and waited for the police officer to approach her vehicle. The officer, a middle-aged white man, strode up to Sarah's car with an authoritative demeanor. "Good morning, ma'am. Do you know why I pulled you over today?" he asked in a stern tone. "No, officer. I'm not sure what I've done," Sarah replied, doing her best to keep her voice calm and respectful. "You were traveling 5 miles per hour over the speed limit," the officer stated matter-of-factly as he scanned her license and registration. "I'm going to have to issue you a citation." Sarah nodded, trying to conceal her growing unease. "I see. I didn't realize I was speeding. I'll be more careful going forward." The officer returned to his patrol car to fill out the citation, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. She couldn't help but feel frustrated by the situation. In her experience, minor traffic infractions often resulted in harsh punishments for people of color, while white drivers frequently receive more lenient treatment. When the officer returned, he handed Sarah the ticket. "Here you are, ma'am. You'll need to appear in court on the date listed to resolve this matter." "Thank you, officer," Sarah said, accepting the citation with a tight-lipped smile. As the police car pulled away, she glanced down at the fine amount, $150. That was a significant sum, representing nearly a full day's pay for her. The prospect of taking time off work to appear in court only added to her growing sense of anxiety. As she resumed her drive to the office, Sarah couldn't stop dwelling on the encounter. She knew from experience that even minor interactions with law enforcement could escalate quickly for black individuals. The officer's stern demeanor and the steep fine had left her feeling unsettled and unfairly targeted. Once at her desk, Sarah struggled to focus on her work tasks. Her mind kept returning to the traffic stop and the injustice she felt. She wondered how many other people in her community had experienced similar situations where a routine interaction with the police resulted in disproportionate consequences. As lunchtime approached, Sarah decided to confide in her closest colleague, Angela, who was also a woman of color. Angela listened intently, her brow furrowing with concern as Sarah recounted the events of the morning. "That's so unfair," Angela said, shaking her head. "I can't believe they're hitting you with a $150 fine for going 5 miles over the limit. That's outrageous." Sarah nodded grimly. "I know. And having to take time off work to go to court is just going to make things even harder. It's like the system is designed to keep people like us down." Angela reached across the desk and squeezed Sarah's hand reassuringly. "Don't worry, girl. We're going to figure this out. Maybe there's something we can do to challenge that ticket." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for her friend's support. Though the encounter with the officer had left her feeling powerless, Angela's words reignited a spark of determination within her. Perhaps there was a way to fight back against this apparent injustice. With a renewed sense of purpose, Sarah began to consider her options, determined to challenge the citation and restore a sense of fairness in her life. The morning of Sarah's court appearance dawned clear and crisp. As she made her way to the imposing courthouse, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of her stomach. She couldn't help but recall the condescending tone the police officer had used when issuing her the citation, and the prospect of standing before a judge only heightened her nerves. When Sarah arrived at the courthouse, she found the lobby bustling with activity. People of various backgrounds waited in line to be processed, their faces etched with a mix of anxiety and resignation. As Sarah joined the queue, she noticed that the majority of those present appeared to be people of color. After several minutes, Sarah's name was finally called, and she approached the counter to check in. The court clerk, a middle-aged white woman, eyed her with a neutral expression as she reviewed the paperwork. You're here for a speeding violation, is that correct? The clerk asked in a monotone voice. Yes, that's right, Sarah replied, trying to keep her tone even. All right. The judge will see you shortly. Have a seat and wait for your name to be called. Sarah nodded and made her way to the wooden benches that lined the walls of the courtroom. As she waited, she observed the proceedings, noting the apparent disparity in how the judge interacted with different defendants. Those who appeared to be white were often granted leniency or had their cases quickly resolved, while people of color seemed to face harsher scrutiny and stiffer penalties. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah's name was called, and she stood to approach the bench. The judge, a distinguished-looking white man in his 60s, regarded her with a stern expression as she came to a stop in front of him. Sarah Johnson, the judge began, his voice deep and authoritative. You're here today for a speeding violation. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Sarah replied, her heart racing. I didn't realize I was exceeding the speed limit, and the fine seems quite high for such a minor infraction. The judge's brow furrowed as he reviewed the citation. The officer indicates you were traveling 5 miles per hour over the posted limit. That's a $150 fine, which is standard for this type of offense. But Your Honor, Sarah interjected, I have a clean driving record, and I was only slightly over the limit. Couldn't you possibly reduce the fine or allow me to attend a defensive driving course instead? The judge's expression remained impassive. Ms. Johnson, the law is clear on this matter. Ignorance of the speed limit is not an excuse. I'm afraid I can't make any exceptions in your case. Sarah felt her stomach twist with disappointment and frustration. She had hoped the judge might show some leniency, but it was evident he was unwilling to deviate from the standard protocol, regardless of the circumstances. Your Honor, I really can't afford to pay a $150 fine, she pleaded. I work as an administrative assistant, and that's nearly a full day's pay for me. Isn't there any way we could compromise? The judge's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward slightly. Ms. Johnson, the penalty is non-negotiable. If you can't pay the fine, you'll need to arrange a payment plan with the court, but I won't be reducing the amount. Sarah felt her face flush with frustration and humiliation as the judge dismissed her concerns with such disregard. It was clear he had no interest in understanding her personal circumstances or the disproportionate impact this fine would have on her life. Sensing that further argument would be futile, Sarah resigned herself to the judge's decision. Very well, Your Honor. I'll make the necessary arrangements to pay the fine. The judge nodded curtly. See that you do. Court is adjourned. As Sarah turned to leave the courtroom, a sense of resignation washed over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the system had once again failed to provide her with the fair and compassionate treatment she had hoped for. The road ahead seemed daunting, but Sarah was determined to find a way to challenge this injustice, no matter the cost. As Sarah left the courthouse, a mix of emotions swirled within her. Disappointment, frustration, and a growing sense of determination all vied for attention. She had entered the courtroom hopeful that the judge would show leniency, but instead, she had been met with a cold, unyielding response. Clutching the $150 citation in her hand, Sarah made her way back to the office, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that the judge's ruling had been unfair, driven more by his own biases than by the facts of the case. Once back at her desk, Sarah shared the details of the court hearing with her colleague and confidant, Angela. As expected, Angela was outraged by the judge's actions. I can't believe he wouldn't even consider reducing the fine, Angela said, shaking her head. That's just ridiculous. $150 is way too much for a minor speeding violation. It's like he didn't even care about the impact it would have on you. Sarah nodded grimly. I know. I tried to explain my situation, but he just shut me down. It's like he had already made up his mind before I even stepped into that courtroom. Angela's brow furrowed with concern. So, what are you going to do now? You can't just let this go. Sarah paused, considering her options. I'm not sure yet. I know I need to do something, but I'm not even sure where to start. I mean, how do you challenge a judge's decision? Well, you could try appealing the ruling, Angela suggested. There must be a process for that, right? Or maybe you could file a complaint with the Judicial Oversight Committee or something. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's a good idea. I'll have to look into the appeals process, see if there's any way I can get this decision overturned. Over the next few days, Sarah pored over legal resources, searching for a path forward. She learned that appealing a judge's decision was a complex and often daunting process, but she was determined to see it through. The more she researched, the more convinced she became that the judge's actions had been driven by racial bias. Emboldened by her newfound knowledge, Sarah reached out to a local civil rights organization, seeking their guidance and support. The organization's lawyers listened intently to her story and agreed that the judge's ruling appeared to be part of a larger pattern of racial inequity in the court system. We see this kind of thing far too often, one of the lawyers, a seasoned civil rights advocate, told Sarah. Judges wielding their power to unfairly punish people of color, often with little regard for the real-world consequences. But we're here to help you fight back. With the organization's backing, Sarah filed an appeal, challenging the judge's decision on the grounds of racial bias and disproportionate impact. The process was arduous, requiring her to gather evidence, submit written arguments, and navigate a complex legal landscape. As the weeks passed, Sarah's determination only grew stronger. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was driven by a deep sense of injustice and a desire to enact meaningful change. Finally, after months of painstaking effort, Sarah's case was heard by a panel of appellate judges. She presented her case with unwavering conviction, detailing the disparity she had witnessed in the courtroom and the undue hardship the fine would impose on her life. To Sarah's immense relief, the appellate court ruled in her favor, overturning the original fine and ordering the city to implement reforms to address racial bias in the judicial system. It was a hard-won victory, but one that filled Sarah with a renewed sense of hope and purpose. As she left the courthouse, Sarah couldn't help but feel a surge of pride and determination. This was just the beginning of her fight for justice, and she was more resolute than ever to continue challenging the systemic inequities that had long plagued her community. News of Sarah's victory in the appellate court quickly spread through the local African American community. Many residents, who had long been frustrated by similar experiences of racial bias in the justice system, were buoyed by the news. Within days, word of the case had reached the ears of community leaders and local civil rights activists. Recognizing the broader significance of Sarah's triumph, they saw an opportunity to harness the momentum and push for more systemic change. One of the first to take action was Pastor Reverend Jackson, a respected figure in the community known for his unwavering commitment to social justice. He reached out to Sarah, eager to learn more about her case and offer his support. When I heard about what happened to you in that courtroom, I was outraged but not surprised, Reverend Jackson said during their meeting. Time and time again, we've seen our people subjected to this kind of blatant discrimination, all at the hands of a so-called justice system that seems rigged against us. Sarah nodded solemnly. That's exactly how I felt, Reverend. I went in there hoping the judge would at least hear me out, but he made it clear from the start that he had no intention of showing any leniency. Reverend Jackson stroked his chin pensively. Well, your victory in the appellate court is a significant step, but we can't stop there. This is just one case. We need to shine a light on the broader pattern of racial bias that plagues our criminal justice system. Sarah's eyes widened as she considered the implications of Reverend Jackson's words. What are you suggesting, exactly? I think it's time we mobilize the community to demand real, lasting change, the Reverend declared. We need to organize peaceful demonstrations, rally support from local leaders, and put sustained pressure on the authorities to address these systemic issues. Intrigued by the Reverend's proposal, Sarah listened intently as he outlined his vision. The idea of bringing the community together to fight for justice resonated deeply with her. After years of feeling powerless in the face of an unjust system, The prospect of collective action filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. "I'm in," Sarah said without hesitation. "Whatever you need me to do, I'm here to help. This isn't just about my case anymore. It's about securing a better future for all of us." Reverend Jackson smiled and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's what I like to hear. Now, let's get to work. We got a lot of organizing to do." Over the next several weeks, Reverend Jackson and Sarah spearheaded a grassroots movement, rallying the support of local civil rights organizations, community groups, and concerned citizens. They organized a series of peaceful protests and vigils, drawing hundreds of participants to the steps of the courthouse where Sarah had faced the judge. The demonstrations quickly gained momentum, with the growing crowds chanting slogans and holding banners that condemned the court's apparent bias against people of color. Local media outlets took notice, amplifying the community's message and calling for greater accountability within the judicial system. As the protests continued, Sarah found herself at the forefront of the movement, her once personal struggle now transformed into a citywide crusade for racial justice. She spoke passionately at rallies, sharing her story and inspiring others to join the fight. "We're not just fighting for me," Sarah would declare, her voice resonating with conviction. "We're fighting for our children, our families, and our entire community. We won't stop until we see real, lasting change." The authorities, initially dismissive of the protesters' demands, soon found themselves under mounting pressure to address the community's concerns. Elected officials and court administrators were forced to acknowledge the systemic issues that had been laid bare, setting the stage for what promised to be a prolonged and contentious battle for reform. As the momentum built, Sarah couldn't help but feel a mixture of trepidation and determination. She knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, but she was more resolute than ever to see this fight through to the end. As the community rallies led by Reverend Jackson and Sarah gained national attention, the city's elected officials and court administrators found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The growing chorus of voices demanding reform of the judicial system could no longer be ignored. The local mayor, a middle-aged white man named Thomas Wilkins, held a press conference to address the ongoing protests. Flanked by the city's police chief and the presiding judge from Sarah's case, Wilkins struck a defensive tone as he faced the assembled media. "Let me be clear. The judicial process in this city is fair and equitable for all," Wilkins declared, his brow furrowed. "The fines and sentences handed down by our judges are based solely on the facts of each case, without any consideration of race or other demographic factors." Reverend Jackson, who had been invited to attend the press conference, stood and shook his head in disagreement. "That simply isn't true, Mayor Wilkins. The evidence in this case, and in countless others, clearly demonstrates a disturbing pattern of racial bias within our courts." The judge, a stern-faced man in his 60s, stepped forward to rebut Reverend Jackson's claim. The Reverend is entitled to his opinion, but the facts speak for themselves. The fine levied against Ms. Johnson was completely in line with our established guidelines for traffic violations. Sarah, who was also present, felt her blood boil as the judge dismissed her experience with such casual indifference. She couldn't help but wonder how many other people of color had been subjected to similar unjust treatment under his watch. "Guidelines can be unjust, Your Honor," Sarah interjected, her voice rising with emotion. "When the system is designed to disproportionately target and punish certain communities, following the rules doesn't make it right." The police chief, a burly man with a graying mustache, intervened. "Now hold on a minute. We're not going to sit here and be accused of racism. Our officers enforce the law equally, regardless of a person's race or background." Reverend Jackson fixed the police chief with a steely gaze. "Then why is it that the majority of people I see in that courtroom are people of color? Why are the fines and sentences so much harsher for them compared to their white counterparts?" The mayor raised his hands, attempting to diffuse the growing tension. "Let's all take a step back and try to have a rational, constructive discussion. No one is denying that there may be room for improvement in our judicial system. But making accusations and inflammatory statements isn't going to help anyone. Sarah felt her frustration mounting. With all due respect, Mayor Wilkins, we've been trying to have a rational, constructive discussion for years. And what has it gotten us? More of the same injustice, day after day. Reverend Jackson nodded in agreement. The time for discussion is over. It's time for action. We're demanding a complete overhaul of the court system, starting with the removal of Judge Holloway and a comprehensive review of sentencing practices. The judge, his face flushing with anger, opened his mouth to respond, but the mayor cut him off with a raised hand. Gentlemen, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. We're willing to listen to your concerns and explore potential reforms, but any talk of removing judges or overhauling the system is simply not on the table at this time. Reverend Jackson's eyes narrowed, and his voice took on a tone of unwavering determination. Then you leave us no choice. This community will not rest until we see real, meaningful change. The protests will continue, and we'll take this fight all the way to the state capitol, if we have to. As the press conference descended into a heated exchange, Sarah watched with a mix of frustration and resolve. She knew that the battle for true justice was far from over, but she was more committed than ever to see it through, no matter the cost. In the weeks following the contentious press conference, the community's demands for reform only intensified. Rallies and protests continued to draw ever-growing crowds, with participants carrying signs that read "Equality under the law" and chanting slogans like "No justice, no peace." Reverend Jackson, ever the skilled organizer, leveraged the heightened public attention to galvanize support from local civil rights organizations and influential figures. Together, they formulated a comprehensive legal strategy to challenge the systemic biases within the judicial system. We've tried the diplomatic approach, and it's clear the authorities aren't willing to budge, Reverend Jackson told Sarah during a strategy meeting. Now it's time to take this fight to the courtroom. Sarah nodded, her eyes alight with determination. I'm ready, whatever it takes to ensure that no one else has to go through what I did. With the backing of a team of experienced civil rights attorneys, Sarah and Reverend Jackson filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city, the presiding judge from Sarah's case, and the police department. The complaint alleged a pattern of racial discrimination in sentencing, as well as a failure to provide equal protection under the law. The lawsuit quickly gained national attention, with media outlets closely following the developments. The city's leaders, now facing the prospect of a high-profile legal battle, found themselves under intense scrutiny. This is a transparent attempt to undermine the integrity of our judicial system, Mayor Wilkins declared in a terse statement. We will vigorously defend our practices and prove that race plays no role in the administration of justice in this city. However, the community's legal team was undaunted. They meticulously compiled evidence, drawing on data analysis, testimonies from affected individuals, and expert witness accounts to build a compelling case. The numbers don't lie, argued one of the civil rights attorneys, a seasoned litigator named Olivia Hawkins. Our data shows that Black and Hispanic defendants in this city receive harsher sentences for the same crimes, even when controlling for factors like criminal history and offense severity. The judge presiding over the case, a respected jurist known for her fairness and impartiality, listened intently to the arguments presented by both sides. She recognized the gravity of the allegations and the potential far-reaching implications of her eventual ruling. As the trial progressed, Sarah found herself at the heart of the proceedings, testifying about her own harrowing experience in the courtroom. She recounted the judge's dismissive attitude, the excessive fine, and the disproportionate impact it had on her life. I'm a hard-working woman, Your Honor, Sarah stated with unwavering conviction. I play by the rules and do my best to be a good citizen. But when I needed the justice system to treat me fairly, it failed me. And I know I'm not alone. The judge's expression remained neutral as she listened to Sarah's testimony, but there was a slight furrow in her brow that suggested she was deeply considering the implications of the case. As the trial dragged on for weeks, the community's resolve only seemed to grow stronger. Rallies and vigils continued outside the courthouse, with protesters chanting slogans and holding signs that demanded accountability and reform. Finally, after months of intense legal wrangling, the judge delivered her ruling. In a sweeping decision, she found the city and the court system guilty of systematic racial discrimination, ordering a complete overhaul of sentencing guidelines and the implementation of new measures to ensure equal treatment under the law. The community erupted in jubilant celebration, with Reverend Jackson and Sarah at the forefront, embracing one another as tears of joy streamed down their faces. While they knew the fight was far from over, this hard-won victory had ignited a spark of hope that would fuel their continued efforts to dismantle the entrenched inequities of the justice system. The judge's landmark ruling in Sarah's case sent shockwaves throughout the city and beyond. Suddenly, the long-standing issues of racial bias and inequality within the criminal justice system had been thrust into the national spotlight. As the case garnered widespread media attention, the city's leaders found themselves under immense pressure to respond. Mayor Wilkins, who had previously taken a defiant stance, now recognized the need for a more conciliatory approach. Eager to regain some semblance of control over the narrative, the mayor convened a public hearing at the city council chambers, inviting community leaders, legal experts, and the key figures involved in the case to participate. On the day of the hearing, the air was thick with tension as an overflow crowd packed the chamber, spilling out into the hallways. Reporters from local and national news outlets jockeyed for position, their cameras and microphones at the ready. Reverend Jackson, seated alongside Sarah, and the team of civil rights attorneys, surveyed the scene with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. They knew that this was a critical moment, a chance to amplify the community's demands for lasting change. As the mayor called the hearing to order, he struck a conciliatory tone, acknowledging the deeply troubling issues that had been brought to light by the court's ruling. Make no mistake, the city takes these findings very seriously, Wilkins declared, his gaze sweeping across the audience. We are committed to working with the community to implement meaningful reforms and ensure equal justice for all. Reverend Jackson wasted no time in taking the floor, his booming voice commanding the attention of everyone present. With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, the time for empty promises has long passed, the Reverend said, his brow furrowed with a mixture of frustration and determination. We've heard these kinds of platitudes before, and they've done nothing to address the systemic racism that plagues our courts. The mayor frowned, clearly taken aback by the Reverend's forceful response. Reverend Jackson, I understand your skepticism, but I assure you, this time will be different. We're here to listen, to engage in a constructive dialogue, and to work collaboratively towards solutions. Solutions? Reverend Jackson scoffed. How about starting with the immediate removal of Judge Holloway, the man whose egregious actions sparked this entire crisis? The judge in question, who sat stoically in the front row, bristled at the Reverend's words. I object to this attack on my character and my judicial record, he interjected, his voice laced with indignation. I have served this community for over 2 decades with the utmost integrity. Sarah, who had been listening intently, felt a surge of anger at the judge's dismissive tone. She stood up, her own voice rising to match the Reverend's. Your Honor, with all due respect, your actions in my case clearly demonstrate a lack of integrity and a disregard for the principles of equal justice, she said, her eyes narrowing. How many other people of color have been subjected to your biased rulings over the years? The chamber erupted in a cacophony of murmurs and shouts as the confrontation unfolded. The mayor tried in vain to regain control of the proceedings, but the voices of the community had been unleashed, and they refused to be silenced. Amidst the chaos, the civil rights attorneys presented a detailed analysis of sentencing data, highlighting the stark racial disparities that had long plagued the city's courts. They demanded immediate action, including the implementation of comprehensive bias training for all court personnel and the establishment of an independent oversight committee. As the hearing dragged on, The tension in the room only seemed to escalate. The mayor and other city officials found themselves on the defensive, their attempts to placate the community falling flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence of systemic injustice. By the time the hearing drew to a close, it was clear that the battle for true reform was far from over. But Sarah and the community she represented had demonstrated their unwavering commitment to the fight, setting the stage for an even more arduous and consequential struggle in the months and years to come. The public hearing had been a contentious and emotionally charged affair, with tensions running high between the city's leadership and the community's advocates for reform. But in the end, the weight of the evidence and the persistent demands for change proved too powerful to ignore. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the court's landmark ruling in Sarah's case began to be implemented, ushering in a series of sweeping changes to the city's judicial system. First and foremost, Judge Holloway, the presiding judge in Sarah's original case, was swiftly removed from the bench. The city's Judicial Oversight Committee, which had previously been little more than a rubber stamp, was overhauled with the inclusion of community representatives and civil rights advocates. This is an important first step, but it's just the beginning. Reverend Jackson declared at a press conference announcing the reforms. We will continue to vigilantly monitor the implementation of these changes and ensure that they result in tangible improvements for our community. Sarah, standing by Reverend Jackson's side, nodded in agreement. For too long, people like me have been marginalized and mistreated by a system that was supposed to protect us. But no more. Today, we've taken a significant stride towards true justice and equality. The city's new sentencing guidelines, developed with input from legal experts and community stakeholders, aim to address the racial disparities that had long plagued the courts. Mandatory bias training for all court personnel, from judges to bailiffs, was instituted, and an independent review board was established to investigate allegations of discriminatory practices. While the changes were welcomed by the community, many remained cautiously optimistic, aware that dismantling entrenched systemic biases would be a long and arduous process. We've won an important battle, but the war is far from over, said Olivia Hawkins, the lead civil rights attorney who had argued Sarah's case. Lasting reform requires sustained vigilance and a willingness to confront the deep-rooted prejudices that have permeated our institutions for generations. As the city worked to implement the court-ordered reforms, Sarah found herself thrust into the spotlight as a symbol of the community's resilience and determination. She was invited to speak at rallies, town hall meetings, and even before state legislators, sharing her story and advocating for continued progress. I never asked to be a hero, Sarah told a packed auditorium during one such event. All I wanted was to be treated fairly, like any other citizen. But when the system failed me, I knew I had to stand up and fight, not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been on the receiving end of this kind of injustice. The audience erupted in thunderous applause, and Sarah felt a surge of pride and empowerment. She knew that her journey had only just begun, but she was more determined than ever to be a catalyst for change. In the months that followed, the city's efforts to reform the judicial system began to yield tangible results. Sentencing disparities between white and minority defendants began to narrow, and community trust in the courts slowly began to rebuild. However, the road to true equity remained long and arduous. Resistance from entrenched interests, including some members of the city's political establishment, continued to pose a formidable challenge, and the broader systemic issues that had given rise to the crisis in the first place were far from resolved. Nevertheless, Sarah and the community she represented refused to be deterred. They remained vigilant, monitoring the implementation of the reforms and holding the city's leaders accountable for their commitments. As the city marked the one-year anniversary of the landmark court ruling, Sarah stood alongside Reverend Jackson and the civil rights attorneys, reflecting on the hard-won progress that had been made. "This is just the beginning," Sarah declared, her voice brimming with conviction. "We've shown that when a community comes together, when we refuse to be silenced, we can make real, lasting change. and we're not going to stop until true justice is achieved for all." The crowd erupted in cheers, their spirit buoyed by Sarah's words and the knowledge that the fight for equality would continue, no matter the challenges that lay ahead.